The last presentation in this module looks at the motivation behind self-control. If we recall back to my first lecture, I identified our tendency to pursue short-term rewards or immediate gratification as a psychological vulnerability in information security systems. This presentation explores that vulnerability in more detail. As this quote indicates, we are often torn between long-term goals to restrain our behavior in some way and our immediate impulses that promise pleasure and rewards. Think of dieting. Many of us have set a long-term goal of losing weight, which forces us to give up or reduce something we like: chocolate, beer, carbs. The presence of those things we try to give up often induces us to give in. Relatedly, we also have a problem of staying on track for long-term goals. Examples of this are trying to stick to an exercise plan, or trying to finish an important project, or trying to implement a new policy. Okay, so why do we have such a hard time doing these things? First, it's important to realize that we simultaneously process experience in two different ways. The first is a reactive, immediate way, which is automatic and can be considered driven by the way our brain has evolved to respond to opportunity and threat in our environment. Go back to the four universal drives in humans. Our brains react quickly, automatically, if you will, to environmental cues related to acquisition, bonding, defending, and learning. The second way we process experience is a more deliberate and reflective way. We process information and relate it to overarching goals and plans. But these two systems are much different. Think of a sort of an automatic quick response and a more slow deliberate response. So we have this dual systems view of the way we process experience. One is sort of the impulsive, in which there's a specific force, motivational force, inside us, activated by situational cues that are related to global drives, so cake, attractive mate, threat, related to hunger, sex, safety. These things have strong incentive value. They're immediate and short-lived, and spur us to perform the behavior. The second system, which can be called the self-control system, and is geared toward reflection, involves the capacity to override undesired impulses and to refrain from acting on them. It is emphasized by socialization and learning and reinforcement histories, but it is effortful. It requires a lot of attention and effort on our part to override those impulses, and it ends up challenging our self-control, our self-discipline. As many scholars have noted, that following impulses would be okay if we were designed to live only for today and had no regard for others' well-being. However, most unrestrained impulsive behaviors interfere with accomplishing our long-term goals or create interpersonal conflict. Okay, so what are the implications of this dual systems view? Well, when goals and activities compete, short-term goals win out. Okay, there are strong impulses towards immediate gain. We also have, as I mentioned several times in previous lectures, we are creatures of habit. Habit is often slanted towards immediate gain. We're often trying to override habit in reaching our long-term goals. Then there's temporal discounting. Okay, temporal discounting refers to our tendency to discount rewards that will happen in the future. The longer the delay between now and getting the reward, the less value we place on that reward. So all these things sort of gear us or point us towards immediate gain, immediate rewards, immediate goals. There are also volitional problems related to our long-term goals. We may be cognizant of our desire to exercise more or to finish a project, but those things are in the future, and we have what is called the starting problem. We have to garner the resources, think about how we want to approach or strategize to get the goal, and often we just sort of end up procrastinating. It's difficult to get started. Once we start, it's also quite easy for us to get distracted and to switch goals. A good way to think about human motivation is to think about switching TV channels. Okay, we're watching something for a while, then something else sort of catches your eye, or you think about something and you start surfing, or a commercial comes on and you want to check and see what's on a different channel. So you just sort of check it out, and all of a sudden you decide to stay there and watch that show. Well, similar things happen with human motivation. We're pursuing one goal, and for some reason our attention shifts to another goal, and it's easy for us to switch over to that goal. Once we do that, it's very difficult to resume um, pursuit of the long-term goals. So this is sort of the implications. You can see the deck is sort of stacked against long-term goals as a function of this dual system. Okay, so let's look a little bit more closely at this issue of delay of gratification. I'm going to show you some studies that point out why it is crucial to understand this process. There's a famous study conducted by Columbia psychologist Walter Mischel. It's called the marshmallow test. And he started doing these experiments back in the 1970s. What he would do, he would bring children into the laboratory, place them in a room, typical psychology laboratory, table and a chair, put the children in the chair, and then put a marshmallow in front of them and say, I'll give you a choice. You can have a marshmallow now, or you can have 2 marshmallows later if you wait 5 minutes until I return. Okay, so that was a simple task, and he would leave. So the children were faced with, waiting 5 minutes for 2 marshmallows, which they like, or having the 1 marshmallow now. Kids varied in their ability to do this. Some waited a very little bit and ate the 1 marshmallow. Others tried their best to wait 5 minutes before giving in, and others were successful. There's a very cute YouTube video on this. You can probably Google it. The kids, some of them came up with very creative strategies for being able to wait 5 minutes. My favorite is the one little girl who put her hands over her eyes so she could not see the marshmallow. Anyway, it was a simple test of delay of gratification. Mischel then was able to track these children over several years, and he found that 14 years after being tested, 4-year-olds who were successful in waiting the 5 minutes to get the 2 marshmallows were better in terms of psychological adjustment. They were more successful in terms of academic and career outcomes, and they had scored higher SATs scores. Okay, so it's sort of indicating that perhaps self-control was related to success. The adult version of this marshmallow test you've already seen. I showed it to you in the introductory lecture for the class. I asked you to on $100 on April 25th or $125 on April 28th. Most of you would say $125 on April 28th because that's so far in the future. What's the difference of waiting 3 more days? If I said, do you want $100 tomorrow or $125 on April 25th or even 2 weeks from now, most of you would say the $100, at least that's what studies suggest. Okay, so we can recast the dual systems view in another way, and that is to think about the affect or emotion that is experienced and realize that emotion is a powerful source of action. Okay, so think of the 2 distinct self-regulatory systems as a hot and cold system. Okay, the cold rational reflective system that we talked about, this planful, this is the one that takes considerable mental effort. This is what we call the cold system. It's almost the voice, it's all reason, very little emotion. Okay, so it's deliberate, planful, geared towards long-term rewards. Think of the sort of spreadsheets, the approach to problem solving. What are the pros for getting a new car, for example, and what are the cons for getting a new car? Sort of what we think of as a pure reason, unemotional approach. The immediate system is the emotional system, what we would call the hot system. It is the quick, impulsive. It focuses on doing as opposed to planning, and is geared towards the short-term rewards. Okay, so again, these two systems would duke it out. All I'm doing now is just laying a layer of emotion on it. And I think hopefully you can realize how powerful emotions are, and that immediate emotions often override a long-term reason. Okay, so how do impulses develop, though? You might be asking yourself. And again, I'm going to argue that there's a quick emotional reaction involved. Excuse me. Think of impulses as associative clusters that are formed in long-term memory. And think of paired associative learning, excuse me, that occurs over time, where you get stimuli attached up with emotions or affect, which leads to behavior. So seeing, for example, the latest fashions, thinking yourself wearing those makes you feel good, the positive affect, which leads to buying. So we develop this association in memory that buying new things or the latest fashion produces positive affect, which leads to buying on an impulse. Think of these as sort of schemas for responding to the environment. It prepares us for action. We see something, we act, we feel good. The key to this sort of impulse behavior is that there are strong situational cues that trigger the emotional impulse and emotional reaction, which then lead to the behavior. So, as I think I alluded to in our introductory lecture, these two systems actually reside in different parts of the brain. Okay, the cold system, the planning system, resides in the prefrontal cortex, and in particular, a lot of our decisions come in this ventromedial prefrontal cortex. Okay? The hot system is clearly in the emotional center of our brain, the limbic system. If you will, the evolutionarily more primitive section of the brain. The limbic system sends out very, very strong impulses to act, to respond quickly. Often we're able to, and often the role of the prefrontal cortex is to check those impulses, to make sure they are consistent with goals. But these impulses can be so strong that they often override the reasoning that resides in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. And if you recall, I gave you this humorous version of the two systems, Spock versus Homer Simpson. Okay, so looking a little more closely at this, failures of our long-term, sticking to our long-term goals, or what you might call willpower, what sort of weakens this cool-headed prefrontal cortex system? Three major things. Hot-cold empathy gap, self-control depletion, or what is also called ego depletion, and stress. Deal with stress real quickly. It's a case when, I think most of us under stress sometimes end up acting impulsively and regretting it. So stress sort of interferes with the ability of the prefrontal cortex to check the impulses of the limbic system. I'm going to focus a little bit more on the first two examples, the hot-cold empathy gap and the self-control depletion. Okay, the hot-cold empathy gap refers to the condition in which, when in the planning stages of goal setting, or in the cold state, if you will, we do not appreciate how much our desires and our behavior will be altered when we are under the influence of arousal. As a result, we display a certain amount of naivete about the effects of the environment and the context, and the effect that they will have on our behavior and choices. A classic example of this is the studies of college students. You ask them, would you wear a condom during sex? And in a cold state, yes, everyone states that they will, but in the heat of the moment, many do not use condoms. I'll give you another example, an actual experiment. Excuse me. Suppose I offered to pay you money to visit my lab next week and to perform a painful task. Let's say they're going to ask you to immerse your hand in cold water. How much would you charge for this little sacrifice? Okay, so if I stop you and say, hey, I want you to come to my lab, I want you to do this test, I want you to plunge your hand into ice cold water, how much do you want for that? Okay. Um, Again, this is an actual question that two psychologists, David Reed and George Lowenstein from Carnegie Mellon, posed to undergraduates at their university. You might think that people will be pretty good, or at least consistent, at pricing their own pain, but their answers depended on their experience. Okay. People who had just sampled the effects of ice water immersion demanded the most money for doing it again. So they would, in one case, they would ask the students to plunge their hand in the ice cold water and then ask them, how much money you want to do that? Well, that's painful, so those who just did it would ask for a fairly large amount of money to do that. People who had experienced the pain before, let's say an athlete who put their sprained ankle into ice cold water, but had not experienced it recently, asked for less money. They asked for less compensation than those who had just recently did it. Even though they experienced the pain in the past, they perhaps didn't have a good recall of it, and so they would actually ask for less money than those who had just immediately done it. People who had never experienced the pain before demanded the least money of all. Okay, so they had three different groups: those who had never experienced the pain, those who had experienced the pain in the past, and those who had just immediately experienced the pain. The amount of money asked was correlated with those increased across those three different groups, showing that our ability to forecast what we will experience is not very good. Okay, even if we had experienced it in the past, we forget how painful things perhaps would be. So some implications of this is to understand that our planning, our reasoning is very much state dependent. What is our state of mind at the moment? Okay, if we have been so aroused or conscious of the emotional implications of our behavior recently, then we're probably more able to accurately guess how we will respond. But often we're doing planning in sort of that cold reasoning state, and there is this disconnect between how we think we will feel in the state and how we actually feel. So it is very difficult for us to imagine how we will respond when emotions are different than they currently are. So think about it, plans and intentions are made by cold system, which cannot appreciate the role that affect plays in motivating behavior. That's the cold empathy gap. The other explanation is the ego depletion or self-control depletion. This starts with the basic argument that our ability to control our impulses, to control our behavior, to stay on track towards our goals, relies on an internal cognitive resource that is limited. Okay, so the notion here is that self-control is a limited resource. When we use it up, okay, it weakens our ability to control our impulses and stay on track for our goals. So think of like a muscle metaphor. Even the strongest person doing weights or pull-ups or bench presses, after a while the muscles weaken and you have to stop. Okay, so the same analogy here is that after using self-control for a while, you need to let it rest and recuperate. A lot of this research, by the way, is done by a professor here at the University of Albany, Mark Muraven. He has used a sort of classic experimental paradigm, which you ask participants to do a task where they have to exert high self-control or not. Okay, there's many different paradigms, many different tasks that are used, including things like asking people to suppress thoughts, to not do something they might want to do. Okay, so a typical high self-control manipulation would ask participants to not think of a white bear. Okay, so think of trying not to think of a white bear, and every time you say don't think of white bear, a white bear comes to mind. That sort of thought suppression task is very difficult and demanding on people. Other manipulations would be to ask people to suppress an emotion, to show them a disturbing film and tell them to not display any facial emotions. That also is we're able to do that, but it uses up self-control. Or to keep focus on a target in an extremely distracting environment is another one. Another example is to not do something that we're inclined to do. Okay, so all these manipulations deplete individuals' momentary levels of self-control. Then in phase 2 of the experiment, students are exposed to a second task where, again, they have to exert some self-control. So, for example, dieters may be exposed to cookies and told not to eat the cookies. And then in a second situation, when the experiment is ostensibly over, they're presented with another self-control task. And where they're not supposed to do something, or they're again perhaps trying to restrain their eating. And what you find is that those individuals who are depleted in the first task perform worse on the second self-control task, presumably because they have depleted their self-control. What I've graphed here is the results of one of Mark Muraven's studies. He had them suppress emotion in the first phase of the study, and then these are all dieters, and in the second phase of the study, place cookies in front of them and measure the amount of cookies that subjects ate in one of two conditions: a control condition where they did not have to first try to limit the self-control, and then in the depleted condition where they did. So again, these are dieters. Their goal is not to eat cookies. As you can see, those who were depleted, those who had to do the emotion suppression task first, ate significantly more cookies in the second task than in the first. This is the classic example of coming home and kicking the dog or screaming at your wife. You'd get during the day at work, you're suppressing your emotions, suppressing your frustrations, and then you're successful at doing that. You're successful at self-control, but when then you come home, you've exhausted all your self-control resources, and you lash out against others. So this view of our inability to exert inability to control impulses and stay on task for long-term goals as a result of our depleted self-control. So then the question is there any hope? Well, if you look at Mark Muraven's experiments, in which he relies on the muscle metaphor, we use up our self-control, so we have none left. We have to let it rebuild. You can think of how to make self-control stronger, just like we can make our muscles stronger. Well, if we practice self-control, that decreases the depletion effect. And in fact, Mark Muraven's studies have shown this, that if you have students practice self-control repeatedly, the depletion effect and the subsequent poor performance on a second self-control task weakens. Okay, so just like you can make yourself stronger, you can physically, you can also make yourself stronger from a cognitive or self-control perspective. Another way of doing this is is through environmental redesign. Remember, I've argued that, or I mentioned earlier, that it is the environmental stimuli that activate the impulses that lead to our lack of self-control. Well, if you redesign the environment to get rid of some of these stimuli, or to make them less salient, or to counter them, then people are much better able to stick to the long-term plans or to exert self-control. We will look at some of those techniques later in the semester. There are also sort of little nudges that we can give to people to address the volitional problem. We'll use something called implementation intentions to get them to begin pursuing their goals and sticking to their goals. An implementation intention is a very simple intervention. It basically involves getting people to write down what they're going to do when they encounter a particular environmental stimulus. And so again, this is sort of breaking up the connection between an environmental stimulus and impulsive of behavior. And then finally, another technique would be to get people to publicly commit to goals. Once we publicly commit to long-term goals, we're much more likely to stay focused on them. Okay, publicly committing to a specific action greatly improves the odds of success. Then finally, for those of you who may really be trying to stick to a goal and having difficulty with it, you might want to check out this website, stick.com. They're started by two economists, and it sort of adds a financial commitment to social commitment. You publicly state what you want to do, but then you also put some money behind it. Not surprising, economists came up with it, but it's sort of cute. You basically set a goal. You set a judge or assign a judge to see if you meet the goal. And then there's some stake put up, like if I don't reach my goal of losing if I'm losing 20 pounds in 2 months, then I'm going to donate $25 to a cause that I do not normally support. Okay, that's sort of the key. If you're a Democrat, it's okay, I'm going to give $25 to the Republican candidate in my district. It gives you a little bit more incentive to hit that target. So it's a cute little site, but it's actually been shown to be fairly successful at getting people to stick towards their goals. Anyway, that's sort of a little bit of an overview, a little bit of a review of the different motivations behind self-control and why we do not always successfully reach our intended goals, and why we get sidetracked by short-term impulses and not able to delay gratification. Okay, again, for each of these modules, there's a discussion board, a Q&A discussion board that I will post, and if you have any questions on these, anything I say here, please post, and I'll be glad to respond. Thank you, and have a good day.